Okay, we're going to wrap up World War II today. And unfortunately, I'm sure everybody's really disappointed. We're going to wrap up the semester today. Not the way I would normally like to have wrapped it up with you, but it is what it is. And I certainly wish it were different, but we got to do what we got to do. So, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill believed that the abrupt end of the Pacific War saved 1 million Americans and 250,000 Britons. But VJ Day was not the end of the suffering for the residents of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by a long stretch. Besides the casualties inflicted on the day of the bombing, thousands more died from burns, radiation sickness, and other related injuries within several months. Most of the dead and wounded were Japanese civilians, although there was a large military presence in Hiroshima, and thousands of foreign laborers were in both cities, including at least 2 American POWs. And though it's difficult to calculate long-term effects, many scientists believe the bombings increased rates of cancer and other radiation-related disorders in the region throughout the lifespan of the survivors. Many people today still debate what role the bombings had in Japan's surrender and whether the human and financial cost of their use was worth the benefit. President Truman, however, stood by his decision. But no atomic weapons have ever been used in warfare since that time by any nation. Throughout the course of World War II, leaders of many allied nations met many times to discuss strategy. Then near the end of the war, 2 historic conferences shaped the post-war world, and we've alluded to them, but I want to go into a little more detail about them because they really did shape what came to be the Cold War world that lasted into the 1990s. In the summer of 1940, newly elected British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had serious problems. Japan had already seized economically valuable British colonies in the Pacific, like Hong Kong. Now, Churchill watched as the Nazi war machine overran most of Western Europe and then set its sights on England. Churchill desperately needed help, and within days of his own election, he began writing to Franklin Roosevelt, trying to convince the president that without America's involvement, Britain might be forced to surrender. In August 1941, the two met face to face, and although World War II had been raging for nearly 2 years, America was not yet in the fight. To keep it secret and to, even if it was found out, to make it as so that it wasn't really America, they met on a warship in the middle of the Atlantic. So America was not yet in the fight, that even though it had been raging for 2 years. Still on board a ship at anchor near the Canadian coast, the United States and Britain outlined the Atlantic Charter, which is an 8-point statement of Allied war aims, including the disarmament of the Axis powers and commitment to a free world after the war. The United States finally entered World War II in December 1941, following the Japanese attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. And within weeks, Churchill visited Washington, D.C. to begin the first of many wartime conferences to discuss Allied strategy. Now, different nations gathered at different times and in different places on at least 20 different occasions. They agreed to make Hitler their top priority before the war in the Pacific, just how to take back Europe and which generals should be in charge, etc. They agreed to accept only unconditional surrender without any separate peace treaties with Axis powers. They promised China greater influence in Asia after the war, and they laid the framework for the United Nations to replace the League of Nations. It had a little bit more teeth and bite to it. And then in February 1945, when the end of the European war was in sight, the big three, and this was Roosevelt, Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, met for the second and final time to determine the fate of the post-war world. Each man had his own agenda when they gathered in Russia for the Yalta Conference. In reality, Stalin held most of the cards. His Red Army now occupied much of Eastern Europe, where it had driven out the Nazis, and it was preparing to invade Berlin itself. And what Stalin wanted most was to spread communism. Still, Roosevelt was determined to convince the Soviets to declare war on Japan, a promise Stalin was willing to make in exchange for a greater sphere of influence in Asia as well. Churchill, completely uninformed of this arrangement, was most concerned about the fate of Poland, half of which Stalin intended to keep. But Poland's sovereignty was the whole reason the British had joined World War II in the first place, so it was not something they were readily willing to give up. Churchill couldn't realistically force the Soviets out of Poland without a new fight, but he insisted that Eastern European nations under new Soviet influence be guaranteed free elections, and Stalin agreed. Perhaps most importantly, though, the Big Three divided it up Germany and the city of Berlin into 4 temporary occupation zones, one for each of their nations and another one for France. Other nations or regions controlled by Axis powers were also slated for occupation, including Korea. None of them could know it at the time, but the plans they made that week would dramatically shape the world for the next half century. However, Roosevelt wouldn't live to see any of it come to fruition. He died 2 months later, just a week before VE Day, or just a few weeks before VE Day. In July 1945, Germany was defeated, but the Allied leaders still had a Pacific War to win and a lot of cleaning up to do in Europe. So they met one last time at the Potsdam Conference in Germany to finish the work. The most significant outcome of this conference may have been the Potsdam Declaration, issued jointly by America, Britain, and China, threatening prompt and utter destruction if Japan did not surrender unconditionally. As for Europe, the leaders argued over treaties and borders and the redrawing of Poland, but easily agreed that Germany would be demilitarized and discriminatory laws from the Nazi era would be repealed. And while a new government was being constructed, Germany would be managed via the 4 zones determined at Yalta. In many ways, a major issue at Potsdam was the tension among the leaders. One awkward situation was the addition of Clement Attlee to the British delegation. The results of the July 5th prime ministerial election weren't yet tallied when the Potsdam conference opened, leaving Churchill in charge. But halfway through the conference, it was finally announced that Churchill had lost his bid for re-election, and Attlee replaced him at the negotiating table. The United States, of course, had a new player as well, Harry Truman, who had acceded to the presidency after Roosevelt's death. So in reality, the only member of the Big Three who had been constant and was still there and therefore had the upper hand because it could kind of direct and guide the other two, tell them, okay, here's what we've already agreed to, was Joseph Stalin. So Stalin tried to take advantage of the change in leadership in a thinly veiled power grab, making territorial and financial demands contrary to the Atlantic Charter. He defended his interests as self-defense against Germany. But President Truman didn't trust Stalin as his predecessor had, as Roosevelt had, and proved to be much less willing to negotiate such issues. Unfortunately, what Truman hoped would be a major bargaining trip, the revelation that American scientists had just successfully tested the world's first atomic bomb, turned out to be pretty anticlimactic because Stalin had actually known about the development of the bomb long before Truman had, thanks to his own spies. So it was clear that without a common enemy, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States were no longer unified for a purpose. The leaders of these and many other nations had been able to talk through their differences for 5 years, but Potsdam concluded the wartime diplomacy, and as Winston Churchill famously said, an iron curtain has descended across Europe, as Europe was now divided between the communist Eastern European nations and the democratic and free Western European nations that eventually both sides coalesced into military alliances, the Warsaw Pact in the East, and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that included the United States in the West. A powerful alliance then turned to post-war resentment, suspicion, and mistrust. The world's next great conflict, the Cold War, was just around the corner as a result. And certainly the post-Cold War world we live in, definitely affected by the old Cold War machinations, is what we're experiencing today. And I wish we had time to delve into that in this course, but unfortunately, I think the virus kind of took that away from us, or else we would have tried to get into that. So this is where we have to conclude the course, unfortunately. I hope you've got a good feel for the developments, especially if you've taken Western Civ 1 and Western Civ 2. I hope you have a good feel for the developments of the course of history, why things are kind of the way they are today, and you can consider, you know, the developments in your own life, the way you think about things, about the way they've been thought of. And I did try to include a great deal of intellectual history, because to me, that is the course of the development of history. That ideas take shape, they're acted upon, those results cause new ideas that are then acted upon. It's just this continuing cycle that brings us to the world of today. If you have any questions or anything, please let me know. I'm going to send out a link to this video along with a copy of this unit's exam to go with it. Although I think I might have already sent the exam with the last plans, but I'll send it again. So guys, have a great summer. If you ever need anything, feel free to contact me. I enjoyed the class. I enjoyed you and your participation, and I hope to see you in the future. If you're a senior or if you're a foreign exchange student leaving, be sure to hit me up on Facebook so that I can keep track of you into the future and we can stay in touch and be friends.